We've got about, 15 to 18 different accelerators and incubators in town, not just the Brandery. We've got 4 universities, not just UC, but there's Xavier and Miami and NKU and Thomas More and Mount St. Joe. So when we put that brand out there and started to do that assessment of how many sources of funds there are, how many co-working spaces, did you know there's 140 big co's in Cincinnati that have an appetite for innovation through technology, and then smacked this logo right in the middle of it of Startup Cincy and said, you're all part of this. It really woke people up.
The startup investment landscape is changing, and world-class companies are being built outside of Silicon Valley. We find them, talk with them, and discuss the upside of investing in them. Welcome to Upside.
Woo!
Hello, and welcome to the Upside Podcast, the first podcast finding upside outside of Silicon Valley. I'm Jay Klaus, and I'm accompanied by my co-host, Mr. Over the Rhine himself, Eric Weissman.
That's right, man. Over the Rhine. It's where I live here in Cincinnati. It is one of the most unique neighborhoods, I would say, in the United States. I think you got something similar in New York, you got something similar in San Francisco, and then you got Over the Rhine here in Cincinnati.
For the uninitiated, what is the Rhine, and how are you over it?
I don't think the name actually... I don't know the history of the name, to be honest. The Rhine River is, I believe, in Germany, but it is not in Cincinnati. There is no Rhine to go over in Cincinnati. I probably should know the history of this name because it is a unique name.
Do you know the history of the area? You said it was a unique area. What can you tell us about why it's unique?
It is. It was settled by Germans in the 1800s. In 1850, I believe, Cincinnati was the 6th largest city in the nation. It had about 150,000 people. Today, downtown Cincinnati has somewhere in the 300,000 range. But OTR, which is the shorthand for Over the Rhine, was created in the tenement housing style, which was popular in Germany. So most of the buildings in Over the Rhine are from the late 1800s, which is really cool. They're a unique style. They have the flair of the 1800s. And when they're redone and revitalized, because this area went through some troubles, they are absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, some troubles. I forget who was telling me the story recently of driving. Actually, I think it was literally an Uber driver at South by Southwest. Were you in the car when he was telling the story? He was telling the story of growing up in Louisville or driving to Louisville and passing through Over the Rhine and having to get a police escort out of Over the Rhine because it was maybe the most dangerous area in the country at the time.
Yeah, I think it was the most dangerous neighborhood in the United States like 3 years in a row, about a decade ago.
And you said, you know what? That's where me and friend of the podcast, Colleen, are going to live.
And friend of the podcast, Hank. Yeah, all three of us down there in Over the Rhine. I love the area. There's so much opportunity in the area. There's so much that's undeveloped. There's so much that can be beautiful. And there's a lot of social issues that come along with that. But there's such a rich culture there. There are tunnels that connect a lot of the older buildings as well, because when Prohibition hit, you had all of the bootlegging that would come through Chicago and into New York would go through Cincinnati. A lot of the breweries were here. The guy who is The Great Gatsby is based on actually is from Cincinnati, and all of the beer that he brewed and liquor that he bootlegged kind of made what is called Price Hill a very hot destination for very expensive houses. So there's just a really deep history here, and if you ever do come to Cincinnati, I haven't done it yet, but I recommend checking out the brewery tour, which goes through some of the caves and tunnels and talks a little bit more about this.
Well, I went down to Cincinnati and stayed with you in Over the Rhine back in November 1st, 2018, and we took part in Cincinnati's first ever podcast festival.
It's great because we only had to walk across Washington Park, which is maybe, 0.1 miles, just to get to the podcast festival event at Memorial Hall.
Very easy walk. We recorded this interview with Eric Weissman, who's the Vice President of Communications and Community and Economic Inclusion at Cintrifuse. We had a really great conversation. We thought about maybe making it a part 2, never really got around to it, and so we're releasing the conversation as it was while it's still close to the time of recording. Eric was part of the founding team at Cintrifuse. He was responsible for establishing the strategy, messaging, branding, and positioning for the effort to catalyze growth through attracting and retaining startups. He, at Cintrifuse, leads the team credited with igniting the Startup Cincy effort. They evolved it from just a social media hashtag to a movement, and now have a reputable community recognized from coast to coast.
Right. They were recognized by Inc. magazine as the best way to build a startup community. Union Hall, which is where Cintrifuse is headquartered, is legitimately, you don't get to use this phrase often, Jay, so be prepared, is legitimately a stone's throw away from my apartment. I can throw a stone and hit Union Hall. I wouldn't do that because that's vandalism, but I could do it.
Do you have to stretch? Like, are you doing any long toss beforehand?
No, really. I mean, legitimately, it's across the street. I could cold throw. I might even be able to hit it left-handed.
Wow. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. I wish we had a little bit more time, but that's the reality of doing live events. Sometimes you can't go over like you would regularly go over. So please enjoy this interview with Eric Weissman of Cintrifuse.
Welcome, Cincy Podcast Festival.
Man, Eric, we are feeling the love here. Are you feeling the love?
I am.
Yeah, we're always feeling the love here in Cincinnati at the Cincinnati Podcast Festival. Eric, we have a quick episode today, so can we get on a rocket ship and take the audience through your kind of career starting when you left Ohio State and getting you to Cintrifuse?
Sure. So my background's really been in corporate marketing. Left Ohio State, took a job with Fifth Third Bank here in town on the retail side of things, kind of on the management track of the retail operations and the banking centers and the bank marts, the branches inside of Kroger's. But I always wanted to work for the Walt Disney Company. So the timing was right for me and my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife and the mother of my children, to kind of pick up sticks and go to Orlando. Things were happening there. The Animal Kingdom was just getting built, downtown Disney, Disney's West Side, and the cruise line was just starting off. Ended up with Disney Event Services for a little bit of time. The 25th anniversary was happening where they painted the castle like a big cake, 6-foot gumdrops, etc. I have to remember we're on a rocket ship here. I can barely introduce myself in 15
You don't have to
minutes.
talk like we're on a rocket ship. You can just give us the quick version through what was probably a decade or two.
It can be more of an airplane, I guess. Yeah.
Ended up at Disney Cruise Line right when the brand was getting established. So all of this, kind of new stuff for this gigantic retail and entertainment conglomerate was going to go into the cruise business. So helped establish the brand there, both on the land and sea packages with the resorts that were in the Disney's Magic Kingdom and around that area. But, my wife and I were both from the Midwest. Central Florida is a great place to visit. It's a very transient. There's no sense of community. So we wanted to move back. So I ended up back with Fifth Third Bank, now in retail marketing. So I had the retail experience of being down there, working at the bank previously, and now the marketing experience of working at the Walt Disney Company. I was there for about 7.5 years, left to join a vendor of mine. There was a production company that wanted to get out of the commodity business of how much does this microphone cost and why is your speaker, a nickel more or a nickel less than this person. Ended up running creative services for that organization. That taught me about small business, about getting out there. And if you wanted to eat, you had to go find the beast, kill it, hunt it down, skin it, cook it, bring it back to the villagers. But you had to, the customers weren't coming in unless you went out to get them. So that got me into that side of the world. Left that company and joined a serial entrepreneur, one of the 17 companies that he started. And that got me into this startup world. And it was through somebody that I was networking with. So this was about probably 6.5 years ago now. And then they said, have you heard of Cintrifuse? And I was like, no, I'm much more conservative than that. I'm not a startup guy. I was like, I think this is something that you need to talk about because, you've got a foot in both worlds. On one side of that, I'm a campaign-driven, big budgets, but also big beacons that we're driving towards. I don't get distracted by the tinfoil in the tree. I'm keeping things moving. But at the same stretch on that small business and that startup side, I don't lose my cool when something changes. And I'm used to that dynamism and that organic nature of just making things happen. So I've been with Cintrifuse for a little over 5 years. So I'm into my 6th year now with the organization, part of the founding team. I like to say that I was there when we were making stuff up, and we kind of still are making things up, but it's been a blast.
And So 6 years, you're talking probably about 2012, 2013, Cintrifuse got started?
Yeah, that's when, so the seeds of Cintrifuse were planted probably like 7 years ago, but it was, the organization came to gel about 5.5 years ago.
I would love to hear what that V1 vision of Cintrifuse was, and then catch us up to today.
Sure, at the end of the day, Cintrifuse is an economic development engine. We want people to stay and move to the Greater Cincinnati region, full stop. Now, how are we going to do that, right? It's not going to be, we have partners. We have READY, the Regional Economic Development Initiative. We have the Chamber. We have a bunch of different partners that we looked for to assist in that when we're talking about large manufacturing jobs, call centers, things like that. But who is looking for those gazelles, those small companies that are high growth, which means there's nowhere but up to go, and high potential? So Cintrifuse was formed to kind of add to that mix. As most people know, we were born from the brains of big cos. So these giant corporations, they all get together. There's a group called the Cincinnati Business Committee, or the CBC, and they are what I refer to them as a horizon-looking organization. They're looking out there for what should Cincinnati be doing, where should we be headed, and what icebergs are out there that we should avoid. And one of those, two compelling things happened. One, Chiquita moved out. So we had another Fortune 500 company here. They moved to somewhere in North or South Carolina. I've really lost track now. But they left for tax incentives, right? They left for a reason to somebody else, dangled something out there, and they said, we'll go there. So the CBC realized, Target isn't going to come from Minneapolis to relocate. Those days of trying to pursue those gigantic elephants are maybe past us. The second compelling event was that Delta removed the hub status of the airport. So now, how does a region like ours grow? How do we remain relevant? We're kind of landlocked. We're here in the middle of the country, and we got to do things a little bit differently. So the CBC commissioned the McKinsey Group to do a study about our ecosystem. Paid them a hefty sum to kind of come back and tell us that our baby was ugly, but that's what we have to do. So the McKinsey study came up with about 7 different things that we should be doing, and I'll boil those down to just 3. One, for a city our size, we should be getting more venture capital from the outside. If you want to grow and you want to remain relevant, you can't keep asking the same 5 people for money. We have to be compelling to outside of the 275 loop. The second thing is, there's a lot of jewels going on in the ecosystem. There's an accelerator here and a seed stage investor here and an incubator here, but there's nobody conducting the orchestra. Everybody's kind of playing their own instruments and squeaking, and maybe somebody's making a good sound, but nobody's conducting this whole orchestra. And then the third thing is there's no belly button. There's no one place that I can go in the ecosystem to get plugged in. Where do I go if I'm out of town and I want to see some cool startups, or I want to hold some meetings? In Chicago, it's 1871, for instance. In Austin, it's the Capitol Factory. In Durham, it's the American Underground. So we needed to have that belly button. So working backwards, we formed Union Hall, so 38,000 square feet of space just right around the block here and over the Rhine. 4 floors above ground, 2 floors below ground. There's a basement and a sub-basement. It's like Hogwarts. The building just keeps getting bigger as you go in it. So that's our hub. That's our clubhouse, the treehouse for innovation in and around the city. The second thing is to be that lifeguard in the pool of the innovation that's happening. So there was a hashtag that had just been kind of used as shorthand for the community to kind of tag each other on things, and it was hashtag Startup Cincy. So that was a way that people were communicating and talking to each other, but it wasn't a brand yet. There was a dynamic that if you weren't a graduate of one of the accelerators here in town, you weren't a startup in Cincinnati. If you didn't have money in you from one of the lead, you weren't a startup in Cincinnati. So we kind of put the paddles on that brand, woke it up, gave it a new life, and made everybody a part of this. So it became this lowest common denominator in the best sense that everybody belongs to this thing called Startup Cincy.
And how active was the Startup Cincy flag, we'll call it, when you guys started putting attention into it, and who was using it?
So this startup activity in Cincinnati has been going on for decades. Cincy Tech, Main Street Ventures, all of those things have, there was even a movement called the Digital Rhine, which was, 20 years prior to what we founded here on Vine Street. So it was just happening 2 blocks over. In fact, our new CEO, Cintrifuse, who just started last Thursday, Pete Blackshaw, he founded a company called Planet Feedback and was one of the first ones that moved into that OTR area. So to have that kind of come full circle, this OG Startup Cincy guy to come back, Startup Cincy was not the first thing. It just needed to be woken up. It needed to be polished off a little bit. Since the formation of the brand and some of the branding, Ocean Accelerator has come into the picture, Hillman Accelerator. So we've got about 15 to 18 different accelerators and incubators in town, not just the Brandery. We've got 4 universities, not just UC, but there's Xavier and Miami and NKU and Thomas More and Mount St. Joe. So when we put that brand out there and started to do that assessment of how many sources of funds there are, how many co-working spaces, did you know there's 140 big co's in Cincinnati that have an appetite for innovation through technology, and then smacked this logo right in the middle of it of Startup Cincy and said, you're all part of this. It really woke people up and felt that they could be a part of this ecosystem, that they are a part of this ecosystem. So whether you want to ever found a company, whether you want to work for a startup, whether you want to invest in a startup, whether you're a corporation that just wants to work with startups, whether you're just a fan that's clapping for the parade on the side of the street and you want your ecosystem to be relevant, you're part of Startup Cincy.
I know Eric wants to jump in here, and I'm sorry, I have to ask one more question on this. But right away, when you guys started putting that brand together, that wasn't a Cintrifuse forward thing from the beginning.
No. What do you mean?
Like it wasn't, hey, we're Cintrifuse and Startup Cincy is for you.
It was a thing. And we just knew that as our mission was to draw attention to the Cincinnati region, there needed to be a there. People aren't going to come from Minneapolis and be the first entrepreneur, first founder. They needed to see themselves. And a lot of times they didn't want to go through an accelerator. They weren't ready to give up that equity. They didn't want to give up that capital, and they just didn't want to they didn't have the time. They were already rolling. So if the only front door to the ecosystem is an accelerator, you got to think about that. Thank God for the accelerators because they offer something. If the front door to the ecosystem, they're kind of that welcome mat of saying, no, we've got something for you, whether that's literally dollars or introductions to mentors or et cetera. So the accelerators are a critical part of it, but they can't carry that whole story. So by creating this brand, we allowed everybody to stay in their swim lanes and let the community, kind of be absorbed by everyone.
So I want to go back to kind of the early days for a second. You get this report from McKinsey. It says there's 7 pillars. Here's why your baby's ugly. Here's the 7 things you can do to make it better. You're young. How do you start? Did you start with this Startup Cincy idea, or what was the first thing you did? And can you take us into the weeds a little?
Yeah, so the first thing, if I would go back to 3 things of that, we didn't have a belly button, we didn't have a conductor of the orchestra, and we didn't have outside capital. So we created a fund, and it's a fund of funds. So it sounds like a funny name, but we don't invest directly in startups. We invest in funds that invest in startups. So we copied this off of the Renaissance Fund in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and they have a really enviable regional economic multiplier. So for every dollar that leaves Michigan, I think it's currently $17 comes back in. So that's pretty impressive and counterintuitive, right? So when we go to the funders here in town to say, we've got this idea, here's how we're going to help stoke economic development in Cincinnati by spending money on VCs on the coast. This does not make any sense, but it does. Because now when you've got this, right now we've got about a little under $100 million in assets under management between the 2 funds that we have. Because we've got that honeypot sitting next to us, we've got a line of suitors that goes out the door and around the corner that want to date our daughter. So now they're coming to Cincinnati. They know where Ohio is on a map, which is a thing. They know how to spell Cincinnati. They know that our airport is in Kentucky, and they know some of the quirks, and they know we've got a very engaged corporate ecosystem here, and it's not just Cintrifuse. Then they come to Union Hall like, wow, this is really impressive because I didn't know that this was here. One of my goals is to really, put the hammer down on that, and I want Startup Cincy to be known as the most connected and the most inclusive startup ecosystem in the country. The most connected and the most inclusive ecosystem in the country. Our infrastructure, if you think about it, how, you walked across the street to get here, but let's say we're going to, on a trip. The infrastructure of you being able to know how to do that, I'm going to leave my driveway. I'm going to take a smaller road, go to a bigger road. That road's going to lead me to the airport. I have already bought my ticket. I get on a plane. Then I do the reverse thing. You know how to get places. But if you're an entrepreneur, you don't know how to get places. It's a mystery. You go back to, I know how an accelerator is, but I don't think I want to do that. I don't know if I have an idea, but I really want to work for, an entrepreneur. Maybe I am an entrepreneur. We've got to demystify that word here in Cincinnati, which has kind of become a code word. I'm an entrepreneur is code word for I can't hold a job. That's not fair. That's not accurate. So we want to, help make it easier for people to realize that entrepreneurship is a viable career option.
And how does, you're very involved with Cincinnati and you understand it, and you're doing this benchmarking against other cities. Obviously, you can tell by Ann Arbor, you said Renaissance Fund. How does Cincinnati compare today to some of the other ecosystems out there? What are the relative strengths and maybe some weaknesses?
So I think it was about a month ago. So the context of this list that we found ourselves on, which I'm very proud of, it's a top 10 list of rising hubs, startup hubs in the United States. And I think we were number 6. Columbus, 99 miles away from us, is number 1. We're the only state, Ohio is the only state with 2 cities on that list. It's a list compiled by Forbes, but with information from Steve Case and his group, The Rise of the Rest. So the rise of the rest is, the thesis is, or the facts are that 75% of all venture capital dollars in America, 75% go to 3 states: New York, Massachusetts, and California. 75%. There's the rest of us fighting over the last 25%. So Steve Case knew that wasn't a sustainable equation, so he and his team wrapped a big bus. They go on these road trips. They've done 7 of them now. Cincinnati was on the first road trip, stop number 2. Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Detroit, and I think Nashville was next. So that really was a wake-up call for me and some other folks here in the ecosystem to say, we're not alone. Those first few months, the first year at Cintrifuse, I felt like no one else understands what we're trying to do here, because we're not typical economic development. We didn't have the job incentives. Well, we've got incentives for you. Awesome, Mr. or Mrs. Startup is interested in this. How many people do I have to hire? 1,500 over 3. Like, whoa, I can't do that. I don't even have the space requirements that we need. But then getting involved with organizations like Rise of the Rest, like Techstars, the Kauffman Foundation, et cetera, now you realize that you're not alone, that there are other people that are out there doing the same things that you're doing. Some better, some you can help along the ways. I've learned from those ecosystems. I keep my eye on several. Minnesota is admirable. I think they have more Fortune 500s per capita than us. That's an argument. There's an asterisk there because I think there's some per capita equations that go on them, algebra that I don't.
Some gerrymandering and semantics
But they're cool companies, man. Best Buy is up there, et cetera. So they've really got their act together. I really like Minnesota and some of the people that run that. I try to stay in touch with. Indianapolis is another one. They don't have a central hub. Actually, none of these have a central hub that things spin around. So there's stories that are told as derivatives of everyone else. You kind of have to put everybody in a room and say, here's what India is doing. Here's what Minnesota or Minneapolis is doing. But kind of the epicenter of all this is Kansas City. So Kansas City at its central core is the Kauffman Foundation. So the Kauffman Foundation has been doing this for decades, and they've got Scrooge McDuck money. They've just got billions and billions of dollars to invest in entrepreneurs, and they've been doing it for years. And despite this, sprinkling 50,000, 100,000 grants here and there, first-time business starts are at a 40-year low in the United States. 40-year low. Hasn't been this bad in 40 years. So the Kauffman Foundation is kind of scratching his head, like, what do we do? The usual stuff isn't working. But they've posited that, what if we focus on ecosystem building? The old saw used to be, Brad Feld's first book on startup communities, was you build entrepreneur communities around entrepreneurs. Nothing wrong with that. That does work. But there's another way. And what if we could, Frankenstein an ecosystem together? What if we could, kind of cobble these things together and really, give that shot of adrenaline in the heart, that we don't want to wait that long until we do have a unicorn, until we do have Cover My Meds up in Columbus. We don't want to wait for that. So how do we get all the bits and pieces together? And I think you see that in Cincinnati of trying to be collaborative. But the Kauffman Foundation is realizing that entrepreneurs need communities, communities need ecosystems, ecosystems need builders, and ecosystem building needs to be a discipline. It needs to be a professional course that you could follow.
Have you read The Rainforest, the book?
Yes.
What do you think about it?
Don't make me quote it, though. I don't know what happened on page 50.
Are you suggesting essentially what The Rainforest is saying?
Victor from
San Francisco.
Yeah. I think it was, well, maybe we're thinking about a different book, but there was the Kauffman Foundation, I forget his title, but I think that he either contributed to that or were behind that. But that ecosystem mentality of a rainforest, of saying, this is all kind of a symbiotic relationship here. We need each other. It can't just be in isolation, which is where you come from startup communities of saying somebody who was able to navigate through this gets all their friends together who helped them through this journey and say, let's do this again. Let's do this again for more people besides me because this was a blast and I liked it. We're just kind of getting those together before that.
This idea of the central hub you're talking about, we just had an episode where we talked to Ali Felix in Tampa Bay, and they're building an innovation hub there. How do you practically, as a city, build a central hub? Is that the right thing to do when you have people who come with great intentions say, this is going to be the central hub, and then new people come around and they say, you know what, we need a central hub, and now you have two central hubs?
No, the way you start off with is a coalition of the willing. You need to get people in the same room that say, what do we want to happen? We want more jobs. Okay, what kind of jobs? Full-time, part-time, high-tech, skilled worker? What are we talking about here? What are the 2 or 3 things that we want to move forward? So from a Cintrifuse standpoint, when we came in and said we want to get more capital from the outside and we want to increase the amount of jobs, then you get people on board. And when we put the solidification of the branding of Startup Cincy to kind of relieve everyone of we've got a community here and you're a part of it. So now that we all understand that, we'll get there faster. We can all execute faster with this wind behind us, instead of feeling like, well, I'm off in this area and I'm doing tech transfer at the university. Well, I'm downtown and I'm running a co-working space. Like, no, you actually are. So that coalition, the willing, comes to say, we're all actually in this together. So we're all in our own separate, have our own separate identity and our own swim lane, but we're all rowing in that same direction. And if you're not, you can be rowing in the same direction, just 3 feet away from the shore and just keep banging into the shore. What if we just go for a lighthouse that's out there, or some North Star metaphor that we reach to? So that's what you need first, is that coalition of the willing with some sort of goalpost that's at the end. And then everybody agrees to that, and then you kind of go back to your regularly scheduled program and keep running your accelerator, keep running your co-working space.
It sounds like the ugly baby that we started the story with has grown into an adolescent of sorts. But if we paid McKinsey a hefty sum today, what would they come back with as the pillars on their executive summary that Cincinnati has to fix going forward?
So the irony of that is that some of my Cintrifuse colleagues ran into the person that did the McKinsey research and kind of worked this through. And she was shocked that, wait a minute, you're from Cintrifuse? Are you that place? Did you guys actually do what we asked? So we just took that as a strategic framework. And Wendy Lee, who was our recently departed CEO, and team, got together and said, what are we going to do? How are we going to knock this stuff down? I think that they would come back, and we're on the right track. Talent is something that no one has figured out. Diversity and inclusion is a challenge for every ecosystem. But I'm proud of the strides that we're making here, not just with Cintrifuse, but with all of the ecosystem players and partners. So to find out, I think we still need more of everything. From a zero-sum standpoint, this is not a zero-sum game. We need more co-working spaces. So when we have some, co-working space that's opening up down the street from OTR, and people come to me and like, oh, are you worried that this is going to no, we need more. And we need more angel groups. We need more funds. We need more entrepreneurs. We need more people wanting to be entrepreneurs. So I don't know exactly, how they would quantify that. But when Steve Case came back, so it was 4 years ago when he came, and he came back last summer. And somebody, had a question from the audience of, so Steve, you've been around to 30 odd different ecosystems. Where does Cincinnati rank? And it didn't take him long to answer middle of the pack. I mean, we're not dead last. We've not made up too much ground on, we didn't really have didn't have a crater to crawl out of like Detroit did. Detroit was in trouble. They declared bankruptcy. They sold paintings from their art museum to make payroll. They were in bad shape, and they're doing great. We didn't have any of that. We didn't. Cincinnati's always kind of been on that even keel of we didn't lose our shirt in the .com boom and bust. The ship got righted, and then the mortgage crisis. We didn't. I like to say that if things would have taken off back at that turn of the century with all the .com stuff, and they needed space, they would have raised OTR. We need this to be a tech campus for this, that, but we didn't have to do that. So now we've got dry powder. So Cincinnati has potential. We've got some latent big co's that are eager to get involved in this game. Kroger and Procter & Gamble and Western and Southern and Fifth Third Bank and St. Elizabeth and Children's Hospital and just rattle them off. They're in, and they want to figure out what's next and hopefully be a part of that.
I think something that leads to something we didn't put quite enough emphasis on was just the involvement of the Fortune 500s here in town and how they leaned into the creation of Cintrifuse and were part of that coalition of the willing. I know we're close on time, so I wanted to ask you one final question from me. Cintrifuse is such a rare model. You said this is something that you pulled from this Renaissance fund idea, but it's not something you see in cities across the United States.
The Renaissance was the model for the fund of funds around which the strategic center of everything kind of gravitates. But yeah.
So would you say that if I am Truro, Iowa, or I am Birmingham, Alabama, is a Cintrifuse model viable for my community? And if so, how would I, as a community builder, get started with that model?
It's not right for everybody. We've had over 36, I think the list is up to 42 cities and regions that have come to us. I call it the doorbell report. They came to us and ding dong. How did you guys do this? Tell us how you got the big co's involved. We don't have big co's. How are we going to do this? It gets back to that. What thing are you trying to move? What needle are you trying to move? If you do have big co's, like Kansas City, they've got to come to the table in a different way than they've come before. So we refer to ours as an active network, different than Columbus, different than a lot of these, than even Minneapolis, of, we will pay for this, we'll pay for this pitch competition or whatever, but we're actually, we're pretty deep in these organizations with people that have a pulse on their innovation needs. So we stay as close as we can to them. And, that was one of Wendy's big proponent. She was a proponent of, going back to these CEOs when we didn't have the access that we needed to introduce them to startups. I'm confused here. I thought you wanted this. And, your people aren't calling me back. They're not showing up to these events. And I thought we were here to help. So having them start that conversation is critical. But, it's almost impossible to do that in reverse order.
And one last clarifying point on that. What about if I am a city and whether it's big co's or wealthy individuals, would the fund of fund models be enough to kickstart an ecosystem? Do you think?
I think so. I think the fund of funds model is interesting because it's geographic dispersion, it's industry. There's a vertical. Our investments are made off of. We have an advisory board and an investment committee and a whole team that runs the fund. But the advisory board and the investment committee are made up of our LPs, which are these big co's. So if Children's Hospital has some certain concern that they understand and they would like to know a little bit more about, well, the advisory board and investment committee evaluates those funds. It's got a return on investment. So the primary aim of the fund, it's a for-profit instrument. So Cintrifuse as itself is a non-profit entity, but we run a for-profit fund. First and foremost, they want their money back. So, we're dealing with CFOs, we're dealing with balance sheet, type of stuff. Rule number one is get me my money back. Rule number two is they want front row seats to the freak show. They want curated access to startups. They want cool things to see that even they haven't thought of and they haven't seen. And then the third component is it helps their community out. So now there's something else besides Kroger going on in Kroger's backyard. We're bringing cool companies through. It's fresh talent. It's people with a healthy disrespect for the status quo. It creates a vibrancy around that. So I would say a fund of funds is a very viable model. We're never the biggest checks in a lot of these funds, but it does. We're a strategic investor. When it comes down to that, it's not as easy as putting a fund together, $50 million, and saying now this is going to work. Just like making a T-shirt and slapping a logo on it doesn't mean you have a community. It's a little bit more involved than that.
Eric, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for your time. If people want to learn more from you or follow you after the show, where should they go?
Cintrifuse and Startup Cincy is pretty active on social media. So you can follow us on Twitter at Cintrifuse, CINTRIFUSE, or Startup Cincy, STRATUP CINCY, or I'm just E Weissman, that's EWEISSMANN.
And Jay, if anyone wants to follow Upside on Twitter.
That's right. After the show, if you have any thoughts on this or any questions for us or Eric, you can tweet at us at UpsideFM. We'd love to hear from you. If you or somebody you know would be a good guest for our show, email us at hello@upside.fm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cincy Podcast Festival.
That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's guest, so shoot us an email at hello@upside.fm or find us on Twitter at UpsideFM. We'll be back here next week at the same time talking to another founder in our quest to find upside outside of Silicon Valley. If you or someone you know would make a good guest for our show, please email us or find us on Twitter and let us know. And if you love our show, please leave us a review on iTunes. That goes a long way in helping us spread the word and continue to help bring high-quality guests to the show. Eric and I decided there were a couple things we wanted to share with you at the end of the podcast, and so here we go. Eric Hornung and Jay Klaus are the founding parties of the Upside Podcast. At the time of this recording, we do not own equity or other financial interest in the companies which appear on this show. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinion and do not reflect the opinions of Duff & Phelps LLC and its affiliates, Unreal Collective LLC and its affiliates, or any entity which employ us. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. We have not considered your specific financial situation nor provided any investment advice on this show. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Never mind, bro, that can't be matched. I'm lighting it on fire, used to run victory laps, and still I'm not even tired. It's all about the timing, yeah, that's what they say. Well, I'ma keep on rhyming, find a way.